Okay, afternoon everybody. Here we go. I'm going to give you quite a lot of background on Streetcar as a kind of introductory lesson to it, okay? We'll be looking at Streetcar for about 4 or 5 weeks. You will be looking at it not only as an individual text, but you'll be looking at it as a love text, and you'll also be using it as a key text for post-1945. First of all, the love focus, it's an amazing play for the theme of love, and indeed for the paradigm of all different kinds of love. We will see physical, heterosexual, erotic love. We will see romanticized, chivalric, fin amour style love. We'll be looking at forbidden love. Blanche has a little bit of a liking for young boys. We'll have a look at domestic love. Then we'll look at love as a form of shelter. And then, unfortunately, we'll have to look at the dark side of love, the sadomasochistic side of kind of rough sex, kind of 50 Shades of Grey type of stuff. It's all there in Streetcar. Here is Tennessee Williams, thought by many to be America's greatest 20th century playwright. It really is between him and Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller tends to write more of a realist style, and Tennessee Williams tends to use a lot of symbolism and a lot of poetic dialogue. I've called it a matter of evasion because Tennessee Williams is very much a gay writer, but theatre tends to be more censored than literature. So in his plays, as I'm sure Jasmine will tell you, with Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, the homosexuality is very rarely explicit. It's usually in code, and you have to read quite deeply to see that this is the kind of evasive theme that lies at the center of the play. So, Tennessee Williams was born Thomas Lanier Tennessee Williams in Mississippi. He's a Deep South writer. In fact, most of the writing, that's where Tasha's going to be going, yeah, most of the writing, good writing in America comes from the South. And the South, in American literature, tend to see themselves as the more civilized people. You know, we have this view that all the Southerners are a bunch of racist hicks, etc., rednecks, etc., but they didn't see themselves like that. They saw themselves as gentlemen, and they saw the North as lacking cultural heritage and as being quite Philistine and shallow. So Tennessee Williams is coming out of this tradition of writing as a Southerner. He had a mother who was a very aggressive woman, in many ways, a very all-consuming mother. And Tennessee Williams loves the work of D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence, the British writer who goes on to write, as you know, Lady Chatterley's Lover, had the same parental dynamic. A very violent father who bullied him and despised him for being effeminate, and an incredibly overprotective mother who stifled him and suffocated him and looked after him, okay? His father was also a traveling shoe salesman, and that would be a big theme in one of the plays called The Glass Menagerie. His sister is an enormous figure in his life. She suffered from lifelong mental illness and was institutionalized for much of her life, okay? And she will appear in quite a few of his plays, okay? Right, so moving on from that, because we've done that, family, we know all about that, okay? Here is Rose. Look at that picture of her, quite a haunted face, okay? Suffered from lifelong clinical depression and a whole arrayment of mental disorders. Tennessee Williams was haunted by her because he saw her as too good and too fragile for this world. Now, if you think about Blanche de Bois, which I'm sure you've been reading about in Streetcar, you can see elements of Rose there. You've got to be a bit careful bringing in autobiography into plays, but it does seem that he certainly used his sister as a kind of archetype for a lot of his female characters, okay? He was very closely attached to her and was absolutely devastated after she was hospitalized. In fact, in the end, she received a lobotomy. I don't know if you guys remember from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that it became very popular to have lobotomies, and they could do these in 5 minutes in the end. They literally put something up your nose and hit your brain with a spike, and it would paralyze the frontal cortex of your brain thus reducing your kind of intellectual abstract abilities, but supposedly calming patients, okay? So it's one thing that feminists are very interested in is the way that women have been treated by mental institutions. And Rose is seen as a terribly tragic figure. You'll know at the end of A Streetcar Named Desire that Blanche is taken away to an asylum. Now, the two main forms of treatment in those days would have been ECT, electric shock treatment, and that full frontal lobotomy. So not much of a choice, really. Volts or the hammer. Homosexuality, incredibly important, okay? And Tennessee Williams is one of the first American writers to really look at homosexuality head on. In his short stories, he's incredibly explicit about homosexuality. In his plays, he's much more coded because he has to work within a climate of censorship, okay? He had really a lifelong lover called Frank Merlo, who he met in 1947. Unfortunately, Merlo died in 1961. During this time, Williams did virtually all of his writing, and it was quite a happy time for him. After the death of his partner, Frank Merlo, he became an alcoholic and took to drugs more and more, and had a very tragic life. Very like, say, Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, just retired into alcoholism. As I said to you before, much of the taboo theme of homosexuality is implied in his plays rather than explicitly explored. But we have to go back in time, don't we? And we have to think to ourselves, we have to judge it in the 1950s. And what's happening in American history in the 1950s, guys? Anybody know?
Civil rights.
There's civil rights, but there's also the McCarthy movement. Okay, so there's terror about communism, and it's a time of censorship. In fact, I would compare it to Donald Trump's era now, where I think we're having a similar closing down of any opposition that's occurring. Right, so a bit more autobiography. Tennessee Williams was considered a shy, sickly, confused, very delicate young man. One of the things I'm going to be teaching you about Streetcar Named Desire is even though Blanche is a woman, we could argue that Tennessee Williams writes himself into a female character. He graduated from the University of Iowa in 1938, so he's a war child. Can you see that? He becomes a war child, and I think the war's very important to him. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the war in a minute, okay? He spent much of his adult life in New York, although he was a wanderer, but he really did try and keep in touch with that southern heritage of his, that idea of coming from the deep south. Very interestingly, I think you guys will like this. In 1931, Tennessee Williams worked at a shoe company. It was probably the most unhappy time of his life. And his main colleague there was called Stanley Kowalski. Those of you who've read the play will know that that is basically Estella's husband, the Polish, thuggish, drinking, fighting, masculine, rough kind of ape man is Stanley Kowalski. So clearly Tennessee Williams took this character from real life and moved him into art and used him as a kind of archetype. In 1939, he moves to New Orleans, where the play Streetcar is set, and he changed his name to Tennessee. It's very interesting because he's foregrounding his southernness. It's very important to him, his southernness, okay? And there he writes for the WPA, that's the Works Progress Administration. That's a government body that pays for plays. Right, what are his major works? These are the three that I think it's useful for you to know about. The Glass Menagerie, very important play, changes theatre in America. It has all sorts of innovation, new forms of scenery, of transparent scenery. It uses a lot of symbolism. It's a very groundbreaking play. 1947, probably his most acclaimed and most famous play. Many people think the greatest American play of the 20th century is A Streetcar Named Desire. And again, I'm going to show you there's a lot of symbolism. Alongside naturalism and realism and harshness, there's a lot of poetic symbolism. And then in 1955, there is Cat on the Hot Tin Roof. And in Cat on the Hot Tin Roof, the theme of homosexuality and this idea of forbidden love is covered in the most detail, but is also something that's touched upon in A Streetcar Named Desire. So, going back to The Glass Menagerie, it's first staged in Chicago, then New York, for over 500 performances. The play won the New York Drama Critics Circle Award. Very much groundbreaking. 1947, Streetcar wins the Pulitzer Prize. That's the greatest literary prize in America. 1951, the play is made into a highly successful film, which I urge you all to watch, starring a young Marlon Brando, who goes on to be one of the greatest actors of the 20th century, and Vivien Leigh, one of the greatest actresses of the 20th century, who was in Gone with the Wind and who was married to Laurence Olivier. So great, great actress, okay? Here's a picture from the play of Stanley Kowalski. Anyone recognize the scene? What's happening there? What has Kowalski done? I take it... Exactly. He's unpacked Blanche's clothes and he's throwing her jewellery around, isn't he? Okay, and Stella's tried to stop him in this scene. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof with the amazingly divine, beautiful Elizabeth Taylor is worth watching just because she's so gorgeous in the movie, okay? And it's an amazing film. Once again, if you want to be AA star students, I urge you to watch these two movies, as well as The Glass Menagerie, because it will give you a lot of background and it will give you a sense of Tennessee Williams' style and his characterization. They're all available on Putlocker. Not that I believe in non-copyrighted things, of course. Right, I've told you already about Frank Merlo dying, and Tennessee Williams himself died in 1983, choking on a bottle top. It's interesting, isn't it? Here is another picture of the movie. What do you notice, guys? The way that the movie's been marketed. Highly sexualized, isn't it? 50 Shades of Grey kind of sexuality. Male mastery. Is there a sort of hint of kind of rape there, do you feel? So it's quite interesting because this, one of the reasons why this was such a controversial play is because of its highly explicit, honest portrayal of sexuality. Okay, 30 full-length plays, but as I say, the three that you need to know about are the ones that we've covered, okay? I think I've said most of this, that, oh yes, all his major plays are memory plays. That's very important. His plays really mix the past and the present. In that sense, they're very modernist plays. Unlike most plays, like We Will Do the Doll's House at the end of the year, which is called a well-made play. That's a play in which you can see one event leads to another. It's linear causation. That's not the case in the other plays. In the other plays, we drift in a modernist way between memory and the present. And there are no firm boundaries between memory and the present. So it's much more stream of consciousness. It's much more internalized, okay? An idea of psychological time. And that's going to be very important, okay? Here's a picture of two of the most beautiful people who've ever lived. Anyone recognize who this is? No, it's not Richard Burton. Paul Newman. I forgot his name for a moment. Paul Newman is? He's Brick, isn't he? And Brick is our tortured little latent gay boy, isn't he? Okay. It's not made entirely explicit, but the fact that he can't make love to his wife and he's obsessed by his friend is a big clue, isn't it? Yeah. Elizabeth Taylor is the highly sexually frustrated wife who can't get her beautiful husband to sleep with her, unfortunately, because, Jasmine, he is gay. Is it made explicit? Got to sort of read into it a little bit, okay? The Glass Menagerie is a really important one for you to look at because it is a mixture between realism and symbolism. The Glass Menagerie is the center of the play, and it is based on his sister Rose. And it's all these little glass animals. And this girl lives in an imaginary world where she plays with all these little glass animals. And of course they're glass because they're fragile. And her favorite animal is a unicorn, obviously because it's a mythical, romanticized kind of creature. So we're going to look at Tennessee Williams, and we will look at the patterns of these plays, because what I want you to get a feeling for is that there's this kind of blend of harsh realism gritty sex, violence, etc., together with a lot of poetic symbolism. And yeah, I think his most important theme, and it's a theme that is also present in Streetcar, is the idea of illusion versus reality, and how illusion can never really withstand reality, and how reality will smash through and destroy these poetic imaginary worlds and kill them. Okay, I don't think I want to say too much more about the glass menagerie. Now, as I said before, it's very important that he comes from the Deep South. We need to actually understand that the South, as I said, sees itself as culturally superior. In the play, we will see that Blanche de Bois is coming from the more traditional plantation America, where people of different races knew their place, where there was kind of wealth differentials. And moving to New Orleans is seen as a challenge to this, because in New Orleans, the figure of Stanley Kowalski is the self-made man who's come out of the Second World War and refuses to, stay in his class position. He's a fighting, kind of democratic person who despises privilege and wants to smash it. It's very important that you know that the South really stood for this kind of idea of being a landed elite. They tended to flaunt their wealth. They tended to have very much an aristocratic European idea that industry and working was dirty, and that they were above work, and that land and the possession of land and farming was superior to industrialization. That's why the South tended to look down on the North and see it as a sort of grease monkey place of industry and filthy lucre of money, etc. Okay? Obviously, slavery, the American Civil War was fought over slavery, and so the South really had very little problem with slavery. And that's why racial rights and civil rights were really very poor in the South, and racist and ideas of racial purity in the KKK continue to this day, as some of you know. So in the Civil War, and this is the really important bit, when the South lose, and you know that they lose the Civil War, they really are humiliated. And you have Northern soldiers going to the South and literally raping and pillaging the place. They were called carpetbaggers. Many of you have heard of them. They went in, they basically robbed and raped, and they ravaged the South. And this made the South very, very bitter. And the one way in which they coped with this humiliation was they tended in literature to represent themselves as more poetic, more educated, more elite. And you're going to see that this is very important. You're going to see this within the figure of Blanche de Bois. Now, there was a real interest in the past in the South, because the present was so crap. The country was ravaged. They looked back to a kind of mythical past of chivalry, of good manners, of conservatism, and in particular for women, of romance. It wasn't like the modern pop world in which a guy grabbed you and fondled you and, did the jitterbug with you. They looked back to a much more elitist kind of Jane Austen idea of balls. Now, to get a sense of the cultural history of America, I would strongly recommend that you watch the movie Gone with the Wind. It will give you a sense of the noble, genteel South, this myth that before the war it was a kind of fairyland where people had good manners and good breeding and were more educated. And then you'll understand why the South then is so hostile to modernity and the 20th century and industrialization. It reminds me of Britain, actually, lots of parts of Britain where people still want to live in a kind of medieval world, you know what I mean, of the perfect village, because it's seen as a more model community than a kind of fragmented and alienated 20th century. Here's a lovely picky for you to see the kind of house that Blanche would have come from. Palladian architecture, Doric columns, an idea, all these classical references, this idea of entrenched elite privilege. Now, when Blanche comes to New Orleans to visit her sister Stella, she's living in a broke-down apartment block, isn't she? With the streetcar screaming next door, and with people walking in and out of her house. So you need to look at this and just see why she would be so horrified, and how Blanche and Stella came from this kind of entrenched privilege. Of course, the names are very important, okay? In New Orleans, one of the names is Elysium Fields, which means like paradise or heaven. Of course, it's very ironic because the place in New Orleans is actually quite a rough, kind of prolish place, yeah? Belle Reve, which means, what does it mean, Guy?
Beautiful dream.
Beautiful dreams, thank you very much. I think that's very highly symbolic of this kind of illusionary, romanticized world that Blanche comes from, okay? Okay, and I'll move on. It's set in New Orleans, which is a very racially mixed city, is it not? It's French. There's a Latin quarter. It's very black. It's a challenge to Blanche's white wasp-governed world, okay? Blanche is from that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite, isn't she? She comes to New Orleans. One of the first people she meets is Eunice, who's non-white. She speaks Spanish, a lesser kind of Dago, Mexican kind of language. All of it is a challenge to Blanche's elitist kind of white, privileged rural roots. And it's something that really disturbs her and bothers her. And I want you, when you're reading the play, to think of the music. The music, Dayon, is?
Jazz.
Jazz, and it's trumpet, and it's harsh trumpet. So it's black, it's raw, isn't it? And it's trumpet because trumpet is really a rasping kind of sound of sexuality, of inner cityness, of a new kind of world that's going to challenge this southern elite world, isn't it? Okay? I'm not going to read all of this out, but I want you to see that a lot of it, like the French Quarter, all of this is a challenge to Blanche, okay? Obviously, the traditional English way of looking upon the French is of suspicion. For instance, a condom in Britain, until recently, was called a French letter. Why do you think that was? Well, the French have been associated with sexuality with a kind of dark Latinness, which contrasts with good English, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant purity, etc. The streetcar is absolutely a key symbol. What does it represent, guys? It represents modern mass travel, doesn't it? Blanche would have grown up with carriages or riding on horseback, methods of transport that go back to the Romans. And so this idea of kind of heritage and luxury, etc. This is challenged by the modern fast form of transportation. The streetcar is noisy. You don't have any space on the streetcar. People stand close to you, don't they? It's a kind of public sphere. It's a kind of nightmare for Blanche. It's the new democratic modern world of convenience. And the place names are, you go from Elysium Fields to Desire to Cemetery. All of these destinations are highly symbolic. Elysium Fields because it's a place of heaven, of fantasy. Desire because there's going to be a lot of sexual desire in this play, particularly between Stanley and Stella, who are a couple who are madly in lust with one another and who really represent this kind of raw sexuality and erotica. And remember that our overall paradigm is always love. So if we're thinking about atonement, we're thinking about maybe the sexual aspect of Robbie and Cecilia. But do they have the intellectual aspect? No. And it makes us think about Robbie and Cecilia's relationship and see it as a beautiful kind of balance between erotica and the more cerebral, I won't say platonic, but I'd say more intellectual, abstract elements of attraction, okay? And Tennessee Williams wanted the streetcar to be central to the play. So I want you to think noise, inner cityness, modernity. More historical context, of course, is the play comes shortly after the war. Now, many American men come back from the war, working class men, they fought for their country, they're not going to take any crap anymore. So they're quite adversarial. They're there to get their bit of the pie. They fought for their country, they were good enough to do that. And this is who Stanley Kowalski is, isn't he? He's a working class man. He comes from Polish roots. Traditionally, they've been pushed down by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But they come back from the war, and this time they're not taking any more crap. They're going to fight for their right. They see themselves as empowered, and Stanley Kowalski despises what Blanche stands for, all that elite privilege. He is a self-made man who's working his way up. He's ambitious, he's adversarial, he's aggressive, he's going to fight for what he wants, okay? And we see this kind of street savagery that runs throughout. Also, the American dream is really important because you've got two conflicting ideas of the American dream. You've got this new kind of, see Stanley Kowalski here in his sweaty shirt? He doesn't give a crap. When he comes home, he stinks and stuff. He's worked hard with his hands. He's going to pull his shirt off and show his body to Blanche. She stands for the old idea of an American dream, okay, which is this kind of settled southern idea of privilege, etc. She's going to be horrified by his lack of breeding, his lack of manners. So I want you to see two worlds colliding. Traditional America colliding with 20th century America, okay? And class and race is going to be absolutely central to this, and Tennessee Williams chose New Orleans for a reason. So I'm going to sum up some of the differences now. At the center of the play is the conflict between Stanley and Blanche, yeah? What is this conflict? Stanley is working class, okay? He is a person who works in a factory floor. He works with his hands, he works with his muscle. But it doesn't mean that he's not going places. He really is going places, and Stella actually tells us this, that he's ambitious, he's pushy, he wants to be king in his own house. He's proud of being working class. He's not the kind of working class who's submissive and pushed down. He's the kind of working class who despises those of privilege and who wants to overtake them. Blanche, on the other hand, is nostalgic for a different world. She comes from this massively wealthy family, but they've lost all of their money because the family have been corrupt, they've been drinking, and they've been prostituting and doing various bad things. So the money has drifted away, and by the time Blanche arrives in the play, the house Belle-Rive is lost, the wealth is gone, and she is essentially a beggar in Stanley's house. So she treats him like crap, speaks to him rudely in this elitist, condescending way, but she's actually relying on his money and his hospitality, and this is what he resents so much, okay? Blanche is an English teacher, like myself, a Ponzi English teacher, yeah? She loves Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote the sonnets from the Portuguese. Very important intertextual reference, because Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote nearly all of her poems to her husband, and they are about impossible platonic love, this incredible idealized love. That's what Blanche looks up to, this kind of highly romanticized pink-tinted love, not lust. Stella and Stanley are constantly having sex and banging each other and having this erotic, intense, animalistic relationship. It's a big theme in the play. There is only one bedroom, so every night, unfortunately, Blanche has to listen to that going on. Now, to her, it's horrendous, isn't it? It's animal. It's disgusting. It's not what she associates with love. She has this much more romanticized kind of English literature idea of love. What does Stanley represent? He represents muscular materialism, okay? Muscular, literally. He's a strong, thuggish, fighting kind of guy. He also represents talking about money. He talks about money all the time. As soon as she arrives, he wants to know how much her jewelry cost, how much her dresses are worth, etc. He wants to know where the land has gone, where the house has gone. He wants to see the legal documents. She, on the other hand, Blanche, represents that world that doesn't like to talk about money. That hypocritical rich world that has money but considers it dirty to talk about. Stanley represents raw sexual power. He is pure libido. He gets Stella pregnant. He is reproduction in its finest form. He is the alpha male ape man. I've forgotten the term from the play. Anyway, when he first comes in, he comes in with a packet of meat and he throws it at her. And that is meant to be kind of symbolic, isn't it? That he is the raw caveman coming back with the day's kill. He's traditional in that sense. Of course, Blanche likes this more idea of chivalry in which men take off their cloaks and put them down, and women don't get their feet dirty. She wants to be carried and nurtured and loved and sheltered by a gentleman. Of course, Stanley has a very different idea that a man is king in his house and a woman is there for sexual pleasure, basically. Sorry, guys, that's Stanley. Stanley stands for realism. He hates poetry. Blanche stands for poetry. She talks poetry all the time. Highly symbolically, she puts a Chinese paper lantern over the lamp. Why does she do that, Leon?
So the harsh light doesn't reveal her age.
She is the enemy of light, isn't she? She hates light. She is the vampire figure. Light kills her because it allows people to scrutinize her in the harsh light of day. Stanley, on the other hand, pulls curtains open. He wants an open house. He has nothing to hide. He despises illusion. And of course, Stanley in the end tears the paper lantern symbolically down because
He wants to reveal it for what she really is.
he does. He wants things to be seen in stark, unforgiving, blinding light. Whereas Blanche wants everything to be in soft focus. A poetic idea of reality versus a harsh idea of reality. Stanley is brutal in his manners. He eats like a bit of a pig, doesn't he? He eats standing up. Everything he does is kind of macho, male. There's no gentility, there's no finesse to him. Blanche, we don't even see her eating. She's tiny, she's thin. She stands for the opposite of flesh. If Stanley is flesh, then Blanche is spirit. He's come from the military. He's a warrior. He was successful in the military. He was covered in medals. He was a killer of Japanese people. He is top of the food chain, isn't he? He's straight out of survival of the fittest. Blanche, of course, would never last in that kind of environment. She's domesticated. She stays in her hometown, surrounded from the outside world, living in the small charmed space where history doesn't change. He's naturalistic. He speaks like he thinks. Comfortable is my motto, he says. And Blanche, on the other hand, is highly decorous. She dresses for dinner. She wants manners, etc. He, Stanley, is a survivor. He's the alpha male. Blanche wants the traditional female role of being nurtured and secluded from the harsh world of reality. And now I'm going to call it a day.